Naomi Hargrove stood on a porch in the freezing dark, holding a suitcase in one hand and her 8-year-old daughter's fingers in the other, while behind her, through the windows of a house she had called home for 9 years, the family that just threw her out into the cold kept laughing like nothing had happened at all. What none of them knew, not her husband Caleb, not her mother-in-law Judith, not a single person still sitting warm at that table, was that within 24 hours, everything they owned, the house, the family business, the name they had spent 40 years protecting in that town, would be gone, not stolen, not destroyed by some outside enemy, gone because of one thing Naomi had known quietly for 2 years and never once said out loud, because she was still, foolishly, trying to protect the very people who were about to put her and her daughter out into the November cold on Thanksgiving night. She did not scream. She did not beg to stay. She thanked her mother-in-law for the years of hospitality, in a voice so calm it frightened the people listening more than tears ever could have, took her daughter's hand, and walked out the front door into the kind of cold that gets into your coat before you even reach the driveway. What she was carrying with her that night was worth more than the house behind her. She just had not decided yet whether she was ever going to use it. By the next evening, she would not have a choice. Stay with me, because what happens in the 24 hours after that door closed is the reason this story has been watched by millions of people who could not believe a single word of it was real. It was the kind of November night that gets into your coat before you even step off the porch, the kind that makes your daughter's hand feel smaller in yours than it actually is. Ivy was 8 years old, and she was looking up at her mother with a question in her eyes that Naomi did not yet have the words to answer, not because she didn't know the truth, because the truth was going to take a while to say out loud, even to herself. 24 hours earlier, Naomi Hargrove had been setting a table for 14 people in that same house, folding napkins the way Judith liked them folded, checking on a turkey that was not even her recipe, in a kitchen she had stood in more times than her own mother's. She had believed, right up until the moment it happened, that whatever else was true about this family, she still had a place in it. She was wrong. And by the time the sun rose the next morning, so was almost everyone sitting at that table. Because in 24 hours, the family that stood in that doorway and told Naomi Hargrove she was no longer welcome would lose the house behind her. They would lose the business that built it. They would lose the name they had spent 40 years polishing in that town. And not one of them would understand, not at first, that the woman they had just put out in the cold was the only person who could have stopped it. To understand how a woman who was sent away with nothing became the reason her husband's family lost everything, you have to go back, not months, years. Before she was Caleb Hargrove's wife, Naomi Ellison was a name people used with respect in a small accounting firm 2 hours outside the city. She had grown up watching her mother stretch a single income across 2 children, with a kind of quiet discipline that never asked for admiration, and she carried that same discipline into her work. By 30, she had built a reputation as the person you brought in when the numbers did not add up, and nobody could figure out why. She liked the work because it was honest in a way people often were not. A ledger did not flatter you. It did not pretend. If something was missing, it showed up eventually, no matter how carefully someone tried to hide it. Naomi had a gift for finding that missing thing before it became a crisis, and for years, that gift was the center of how she saw herself. She was not looking for a different life when she met Caleb Hargrove at a colleague's wedding. She was not looking for anything. She had a career she was proud of, an apartment she had furnished herself, and a mother who had passed 2 years earlier, whose absence still sat in the corners of certain rooms. What she was not prepared for was how easy it would feel to be needed by someone. Caleb was warm in the specific way that people are warm when they have never had to work very hard to be liked. He laughed easily. He remembered small details about a conversation days later and made you feel noticed for it. He also had a habit, one Naomi did not clock as a warning sign until years afterward, of glancing toward his mother across a room before answering a question that had nothing to do with her. Judith Hargrove was there that night too, seated at the family's table, with the posture of someone who had spent decades being the most important person in any room she entered. When Caleb brought Naomi over to introduce her, Judith looked her over for exactly as long as it took to form a judgment, and then smiled the kind of smile that does not reach anywhere near the eyes. "So you're the accountant," Judith said, as though Naomi's entire life could be summarized in a job title. Caleb does love someone practical. Naomi laughed it off that night. She would replay that sentence many times over the following 9 years, and each time, it would sound a little less like a compliment and a little more like a sentence being handed down. The first 2 years of the marriage were, by any honest account, good ones. Caleb was attentive. Naomi kept her job at the firm, and the two of them built a small, comfortable life together in a rented house 15 minutes from Walter and Judith's much larger one. It was only after Walter's back surgery, in the 3rd year, that things began to shift, quietly, the way most things that reshape a marriage tend to. Hargrove & Sons Construction had been Walter's company since before Caleb was born, and it employed close to 40 people in a town where good jobs were not easy to find. When Walter went down for surgery and recovery that stretched into months, the books fell into chaos almost immediately, because nobody in the family had ever bothered to understand them the way Walter did. Naomi offered to help, just for a few weeks, she told herself. She sat at the kitchen table of the Hargrove house every evening for 6 weeks, untangling a set of records that had clearly not been reconciled correctly in over a year, and she brought the company back from what would have been, by her professional estimate, a very serious problem. Nobody thanked her the way you would thank a professional for saving a business. Judith thanked her the way you thank a daughter-in-law for pitching in, which is to say, warmly, briefly, and in a tone that made clear the help was expected rather than remarkable. Walter, once he recovered, took the credit at a family dinner for having systems in place that got the company through a rough patch. Naomi said nothing. She told herself it did not matter who got the credit, as long as the company survived and Caleb's family was stable. That was the year Naomi quietly gave notice at her firm. Denise, Caleb's older sister, needed help managing the books full-time, and it made more sense, everyone agreed, for Naomi to step in permanently. Everyone agreed. Naomi could not, even years later, remember the conversation where she herself had actually agreed to it. There is a particular kind of erasure that does not announce itself. It happens in small rooms, at small moments, over a long enough stretch of time that by the time you notice the shape of it, you cannot point to any single event and say, "That was the moment I disappeared." For Naomi, it looked like this. It looked like standing in Judith's kitchen every Thanksgiving for 9 years, cooking dishes Judith had approved in advance, and then being seated at the far end of the table, past the cousins, past the family friends, in a chair that put her closest to the kitchen door, so she could help if anything was needed, during the meal she had spent all morning preparing. It looked like family photographs, where somehow, year after year, Naomi ended up at the very edge of the frame, or was the one holding the camera. It looked like Judith introducing her to new guests, every single time, as Caleb's wife, a full name never once offered, as though Naomi Hargrove had not existed before she married into this family and did not exist as a separate person now. It looked like Caleb, every time, staying quiet, not cruel, never cruel, just quiet, in a way that communicated, without ever saying it out loud, that keeping the peace with his mother mattered more to him than defending his wife. Naomi absorbed all of it, the way you absorb weather. You do not fight the cold. You put on a coat and you keep walking. She told herself, for years, that this was simply what it meant to marry into a family with a strong matriarch, that Judith's coldness was a personality, not a verdict, and that the marriage itself, and Ivy, and the quiet good in Caleb, were worth the discomfort of being tolerated rather than welcomed. If there was one thing that made all of it bearable, it was Ivy. Ivy Hargrove was born in the 6th year of the marriage, 3 weeks early, on a February night that Naomi would later describe as the only time in her adult life she had felt entirely, uncomplicatedly happy. Ivy had Caleb's easy laugh, and Naomi's serious, watchful eyes, and from the earliest months, she seemed to understand her mother in a way that did not require explanation. There is a particular scene worth holding on to here, because it will matter again later. It was an ordinary evening, 18 months before the Thanksgiving that would end everything. Naomi was at the kitchen table in their own small rented house, going over invoices for the family business by lamplight, and Ivy climbed into the chair beside her with a coloring book. Without being asked, Ivy handed her mother a drawing. It was a stick-figure family standing in front of a house, and every single figure in the drawing, unlike the actual family photographs on Judith's mantel, was drawn the same size. "That's you in the middle, Mummy," Ivy said, "because you're the one who holds it together." Naomi kept that drawing. She would carry it, folded, in her bag on Thanksgiving night, though she would not think to look at it again until much later, in a motel room, when she needed a reminder of who she actually was to the person who mattered most. It was Denise who first mentioned the number, and she mentioned it the way people mention things they do not want examined too closely. Naomi had continued managing portions of the company's books on a part-time basis even after Ivy was born, mostly reconciling invoices and payroll, work Denise had officially taken over, but still quietly relied on Naomi to check. One afternoon, about 2 years before the Thanksgiving in question, Naomi noticed a discrepancy in a loan disbursement that did not match the equipment purchase it was supposedly tied to. It was not a large amount, not the kind of thing that would set off alarms on its own. But Naomi had spent a career finding exactly this kind of small inconsistency, the kind that usually meant either a clerical mistake or the beginning of something larger. She mentioned it to Denise, carefully, the way you mention something to a sister-in-law you are trying to stay on good terms with, rather than a subject of an audit. Denise's response was quick, almost too quick. She said it was an old vendor code that hadn't been updated, thanked Naomi for catching it, and changed the subject to something about Ivy's school schedule. Naomi let it go. She told herself she had done her part, flagged it, and it was not her company to run. She did not yet understand that she had just witnessed the first thread of something that had been unraveling for years, and that the family's instinct, when confronted even gently with a question about money, was not to explain but to redirect. By late October of the year, everything changed. There was a tension in the Hargrove family that Naomi could feel but could not name. Judith announced, with more excitement than she usually showed for anything, that this year's Thanksgiving would be bigger than usual. A full house, extended cousins, and, unusually, 2 of Walter's business associates from the bank that had financed several of the company's larger contracts. Caleb grew anxious, in a way Naomi had rarely seen from him. He was short with Ivy over small things. He stopped eating dinner with any real appetite. When Naomi asked him directly what was wrong, he told her it was nothing, just a busy season at the company, and changed the subject the same quick way Denise had, 2 years earlier, when Naomi had asked about the vendor code. One evening, about a week before the holiday, Naomi walked into the small home office off their bedroom to ask Caleb something about Ivy's dentist appointment, and found him at the desk with a folder of documents spread in front of him. He closed it fast, almost too fast, the way a person closes something when getting caught. Mid-thought matters more to them than finishing the thought. "Work stuff," he said. "Nothing for you to worry about." Naomi did not push. She had learned, over 9 years, that pushing rarely got her anywhere in this family. She went back to setting the table for the holiday that was 4 days away, unaware that she was setting it for the last time. Naomi arrived at the Hargrove house at 7 in the morning, as she had every Thanksgiving for 9 years, carrying a dish made from her late mother's recipe, a cranberry relish with orange zest, and a particular kind of sharpness that Naomi's mother used to say cut through all the sweetness of the rest of the meal. It was the one dish on the table that was entirely, unmistakably hers. Judith met her at the kitchen door, already dressed for guests who would not arrive for another 6 hours, and glanced at the dish in Naomi's hands with the specific expression of someone recalculating a seating chart in her head. "Oh," Judith said, "I thought we discussed keeping things a little more traditional this year, with the Whitfields coming. Maybe just leave that in the kitchen as a backup." Naomi set the dish down without comment. She had learned by then that the fastest way through a morning like this was silence and motion, and she moved into the kitchen the way she always did, checking the turkey, starting the sides, falling into the rhythm of a holiday she had spent nearly a decade building with her own 2 hands and receiving almost none of the credit for. By early afternoon, the house had filled. cousins Naomi saw once a year, Judith's sister and her husband, a neighbor from down the road who had known Walter for 30 years, and two men Naomi did not recognize, introduced by Walter as friends from the bank, a phrase that meant nothing to Naomi in the moment but would mean a great deal by the following evening. One of the men, a quiet man in his 50s with a grey overcoat he never fully took off, spent most of the afternoon near Walter, speaking in low tones that stopped whenever anyone got too close. Naomi noticed it the way she noticed most things in that house, from the periphery, without being asked her opinion. Walter stood at the head of the table just before the meal was served, glass raised, and gave the kind of toast he gave most years, about family, about legacy, about what it meant to build something that would outlast you. This year, there was an edge to it that had not been there before. "There's a difference," Walter said, looking around the table, "between people who understand what it means to build something real and people who just show up once it's already built." He did not look at Naomi when he said it. He did not need to. Every person at that table understood exactly who the sentence was aimed at, including Naomi herself, who kept her eyes on her plate and said nothing. It was Denise who escalated it. Midway through the meal, in a lull in the conversation, she set down her fork and looked directly across the table at Naomi, with an expression Naomi had never seen her sister-in-law wear before, something between anxiety and aggression. "You know," Denise said, in a voice pitched just loud enough for the whole table to hear, "Naomi's been asking a lot of questions about the company books lately. Questions she really doesn't have any right to be asking, considering she doesn't even work there anymore." The table went quiet, in the particular way a room goes quiet when everyone senses a fight is starting, and nobody wants to be the one who admits it. Naomi felt her face go warm, not from embarrassment, but from the sudden, sharp understanding that this had been planned. This was not an accident of holiday tension. Someone had decided, before this dinner even began, that Naomi needed to be discredited in front of the entire family, and Naomi had walked into it, holding a dish of cranberry relish nobody wanted on the table. "I asked about one line item 2 years ago," Naomi said quietly, "because it didn't add up. That's all." "That's not all," Denise said, "and I think everyone here would appreciate it if you kept your opinions about this family's business to yourself from now on." Judith did not wait for the tension to settle. She stood, the way she stood at the head of every family gathering when she wanted the room's full attention, and looked down the table at Naomi with an expression of practiced, cold regret. "I think," Judith said, "given everything going on with the company right now, it would be best if you didn't come around quite so much for a while. This is a sensitive time for this family, Naomi, and I need everyone in this house to be focused on protecting what we've built. I'm sure you understand." Caleb said nothing. He looked at his plate. He looked, briefly, at Naomi, and then back at his plate, and in that half-second of eye contact, Naomi understood something about her marriage that she had spent 9 years refusing to fully admit to herself. She was going to have to defend herself in this family, always, alone, because the man she had married was never going to do it for her. It was Ivy who broke the silence that Naomi could not. Ivy, 8 years old, looked around the table at the adults who had all gone quiet and reached for her mother's hand under the table, her small fingers finding Naomi's with the instinct of a child who understands, even without the words for it, that something has gone very wrong. "Mummy," Ivy said, "why is Grandma being mean?" Nobody answered her. Naomi felt something settle in her chest, cold and clear, the way decisions sometimes arrive not with drama, but with a kind of finality that feels almost peaceful. She was not going to argue. She was not going to defend 9 years of dishes cooked and books balanced, and small humiliations absorbed without complaint. She was going to leave, with her daughter, with whatever dignity she had left, and she was never again going to explain herself to people who had already decided, long before this dinner, exactly how much room they were willing to make for her. Naomi stood. She looked at Judith, and her voice, when it came, was even and clear. "Thank you for the years of hospitality," she said. "I mean that more sincerely than you'll probably believe." She turned to Ivy. "Get your coat, sweetheart." Nobody stopped her. That, more than anything Judith or Denise had said, was the detail Naomi would return to in the weeks that followed. 9 years, and not one person at that table, including her own husband, stood up to say this had gone too far. She helped Ivy into her coat in the front hallway, gathered the one bag she kept at the house for overnight visits, and walked out the front door into a November night that had turned sharply cold sometime during dinner. Behind her, through the windows, the party resumed almost immediately, the particular resilience of a family that had spent decades protecting its own comfort above almost everything else. Naomi stood on the porch for a moment, Ivy's hand in hers, looking out at a driveway full of cars belonging to people who would, within 24 hours, understand far less about their own situation than the woman they had just sent out into the cold. She did not cry. She would tell Ruth Delaney, weeks later, that she had expected to cry and simply hadn't, that what she felt instead was something closer to clarity. Whatever loyalty had kept her quiet for years, whatever instinct had told her to protect this family, even when they gave her nothing in return, had ended the moment Judith stood up at that table. She just did not yet know what that clarity was going to cost the people who caused it. If you have ever been made to feel small by people who were supposed to love you, stay with me, because Naomi's story is only getting started. The Cedar Inn sat off the highway about 20 minutes from the Hargrove house, the kind of motel with a flickering vacancy sign and thin carpet that smelled faintly of bleach. Naomi had never stayed there before that night, had driven past it 100 times without once imagining she would need it. She checked in with Ivy, standing quietly beside her, still in her holiday dress, still holding the small stuffed rabbit she brought everywhere, and said nothing about the fact that this was where they would be sleeping on Thanksgiving night. The room had 2 beds and a television bolted to the dresser. Naomi ran a bath for Ivy, because it was the only thing she could think to do that felt like normal life, and sat on the edge of the tub while her daughter played with the bubbles, asking questions Naomi did not have good answers for yet. Why don't we get to go back to Grandma's house? Are we in trouble? Did I do something wrong? No, sweetheart, Naomi said, and meant it completely. You didn't do anything wrong. Not one thing. Later, after Ivy had fallen asleep with the television playing low, Naomi sat at the small round table by the window, with her phone in her hands, for a long time, before she finally called the one person she still trusted completely. Ruth Delaney had been Naomi's mother's closest friend for over 30 years, a retired schoolteacher who lived alone in a small house 20 minutes further out, with a garden she still tended by hand and a spare room she had kept made up, without ever saying why, since Naomi's mother passed. Ruth answered on the second ring, and by midnight, Naomi and Ivy were in Ruth's spare room instead of the motel, Ivy asleep almost instantly, in a bed with a quilt Naomi's own mother had once slept under. Ruth did not ask many questions that first night. She made tea neither of them drank, and sat with Naomi at the kitchen table, while Naomi explained, in pieces, what had happened. When Naomi finally finished, Ruth was quiet for a long moment before she spoke. You have spent 9 years, Ruth said, making yourself smaller so that family would have room to feel important. I loved your mother. She would not recognize the woman who just told me this story, and I do not mean that as an insult to you. I mean it because the woman I remember, the one your mother raised, would never have let it go on this long. Naomi did not have an answer for that. She thought about it for a long time after Ruth had gone to bed, sitting alone at the kitchen table in a house that was not hers, in a life that had, in the space of a single evening, become entirely unrecognizable. Caleb called the next morning, his voice thick with something that might have been guilt but sounded, to Naomi, more like discomfort at having to deal with a situation he would have preferred simply resolved itself. He apologized. In the vague, general way people apologize when they are not actually prepared to change anything. I'm sorry about last night, he said. My mum was way out of line, but things are just really tense right now with the business, and I need you to give it a little time. Once things settle down, I'll talk to her. Caleb, Naomi said, your mother told me, in front of your entire family, that I wasn't welcome in that house. You didn't say a single word. There was a long pause. I know, he said finally. I know. I can't fight with her right now, Naomi. There's a lot going on that you don't understand. Naomi hung up not long after that, and something in her went quiet and settled, the same clarity she had felt on the porch the night before. She was not going to wait for Caleb to find the courage to defend her. She had waited 9 years already. 3 days after Thanksgiving, the Hargrove house had already returned to a kind of studied normal. Judith redecorated the front hall for the coming holiday season, as though nothing unusual had happened, and told the few relatives who asked about Naomi's absence that she was taking some time for herself, a phrase that managed to make the eviction sound like Naomi's own idea. Denise and Preston, however, were not entirely at ease. In the week following Thanksgiving, Denise took several phone calls in the privacy of the back office that she had not taken in front of the family before, her voice low and clipped, at one point audibly saying the words, "We need more time before the review," to someone on the other end of the line. Preston hovered near her during these calls with the tense, watchful posture of a man carrying a secret heavier than he had signed up for. Walter, for his part, seemed to sense something was wrong without fully letting himself understand what. He grew quieter at family dinners, drank a little more than usual, and once, when Ivy's name came up in conversation, went uncharacteristically silent for the rest of the evening. Back at Ruth's house, Naomi spent the first several days simply being present for Ivy, enrolling her temporarily in a nearby school, establishing something that resembled routine. It was Ruth, watching Naomi organize Ivy's school papers with the same meticulous care she used to bring to spreadsheets, who finally said the thing that shifted something in Naomi. "You used to be the best in your firm at finding what other people missed," Ruth said one evening. "I don't think that skill went anywhere just because you stopped using it for 9 years." That night, Naomi took her old laptop out of a box she had not opened since before Ivy was born. She did not have a plan yet, not really. She told herself she was simply organizing her own thoughts, putting on paper the small inconsistencies she had noticed over the years and never fully investigated. The vendor code Denise had brushed off, the loan disbursement that never matched its stated purpose, the strange tension in the weeks before Thanksgiving, the bank representatives at a family dinner where they had no obvious reason to be. She worked late into the night, and by the time she finally closed the laptop, she had found something she recognized as significant, an old document from years earlier, one she had seen in passing during Walter's recovery and never fully understood the weight of at the time. She sat with it for a long moment in the quiet of Ruth's kitchen, and then, for the first time since Thanksgiving, allowed herself to imagine what it might mean to stop protecting people who had never once protected her. Here is what Naomi Hargrove had known, quietly, for almost 2 years, and had never told a single member of her husband's family. During Walter's recovery years earlier, while untangling the company's books, Naomi had noticed a pattern that a less trained eye might have dismissed as sloppy record-keeping. Several loans, taken out against the company's equipment and property, listed purchases and projects that, when Naomi cross-referenced them against actual job sites and vendor receipts, did not fully exist. Not entirely fabricated, which would have been easier to spot. Inflated. Padded. A contract worth $200,000 reported as $350. Equipment purchases listed at prices no vendor in the region actually charged. It was Denise, Naomi eventually realized, who had built much of this pattern, likely with Walter's quiet awareness, even if he was not the architect of it himself, using inflated numbers to secure larger lines of credit than the company's real revenue could have supported, then using new loans to cover the gaps left by old ones. It was the kind of structure that could hold for years, as long as revenue kept climbing enough to service the debt, and as long as nobody outside the family ever looked closely enough to ask why the numbers on paper never quite matched the numbers in the field. Naomi had not said anything at the time, for reasons that, looking back, still made a kind of sense to her, even if she no longer fully agreed with the decision. She was newly stepping into this family. Caleb loved his sister. Walter was recovering from surgery, and the company employed 40 people whose paychecks depended on it staying afloat. Naomi told herself that flagging one vendor code discrepancy to Denise directly, quietly, was the responsible first step, a chance for the family to correct course on its own before it became something worse. She had not expected Denise's response to be a swift redirection rather than genuine concern. And by the time Naomi understood how deep the pattern likely went, she had already been folded fully into the family. Already a wife, already, soon, a mother. And the cost of speaking up felt, in that moment, far higher than the cost of staying quiet. She protected a family that would, 2 years later, stand her up in front of everyone they knew and tell her she was no longer welcome in their home. The quiet man in the grey overcoat at Thanksgiving dinner, Naomi now understood, had not been at that table by coincidence. Hargrove & Sons Construction's primary lender had initiated a routine review of the company's larger credit lines, standard practice, after several years of steady growth, the kind of internal audit banks run periodically on long-term commercial clients. Denise's tense phone calls in the days before the holiday, the ones about needing more time before the review, suddenly made complete sense. Naomi understood now, sitting at Ruth's kitchen table with the old document in front of her, that Judith's ultimatum on Thanksgiving night had never really been about a cranberry relish or a toast about legacy. It had been about silence. Naomi was the one person in that family with the training to recognize what was in those books, the one person who had already asked one uncomfortable question 2 years earlier and might ask another, more dangerous one if a bank auditor ever came calling. Denise's accusation at the dinner table, that Naomi had been asking questions she has no right to ask, had not been an overreaction. It had been a preemptive strike, designed to discredit Naomi before she could become a problem. They had thrown her out not because they no longer needed her. They had thrown her out because they were afraid of exactly what she knew. Naomi sat with that realization for a long time. She did not immediately think in terms of consequences for the family. She thought, instead, about 9 years of small humiliations reframed suddenly in a harder, clearer light. She had not simply been tolerated by people who found her a little too plain, a little too practical. She had been managed, kept close enough to be useful, kept quiet enough to never be dangerous, and discarded the moment that balance tipped. She made a decision that night that would define everything that followed, and it is worth stating plainly, because it is the truest thing about who Naomi Hargrove actually was. She did not decide to destroy her husband's family. She was not interested in revenge, and she would say so, clearly and repeatedly, to anyone who asked her about it in the months to come. She decided, simply, that she was done protecting people who had never once protected her. If anyone asked her, honestly, what she knew, she was finally going to answer honestly. That was all. It would turn out to be more than enough. If you have ever spent years staying quiet to protect people who never once did the same for you, you already understand exactly what Naomi decided that night at Ruth's kitchen table, and you already know that decisions like this one rarely stay quiet for long. The bank's routine review, the one that had brought a quiet man in a grey overcoat to a Thanksgiving dinner table, escalated within 2 weeks into something considerably more formal. A letter arrived at Hargrove & Sons Construction requesting a full accounting of 3 of its largest outstanding loans, along with supporting documentation for the projects those loans had financed. Walter, who still technically held final authority over the company's finances, even as Denise managed its daily operations, opened that letter alone in his office and did not mention it to anyone in the family for 2 full days. When he finally did, at a tense dinner that bore no resemblance to the warm, performative gatherings of years past, the family's attorney recommended they retain outside counsel with experience in commercial lending disputes. Within the week, Mr. Aldous Kane, a measured, unreadable man who represented the bank's interests in the review, had begun requesting interviews with anyone who had handled the company's books over the past several years. It was during this period that the illusion Judith had spent decades maintaining, the picture of a controlled, prosperous, unified family, began to genuinely crack for the first time. Judith confronted Denise directly one evening, having finally pieced together, through half-answers and Walter's uncharacteristic silence, that the trouble with the bank went considerably deeper than a routine paperwork issue. "How long?" Judith asked her daughter, in a conversation Walter later described to Naomi as the loudest he had heard his wife in 30 years of marriage. "How long has this been going on, and how much of it did you build without telling either of us?" Denise did not have a clean answer. What she had, instead, was years of incremental decisions, each one individually small, each one made under pressure to keep the company looking successful enough to satisfy her mother's expectations and her father's legacy, that had compounded into something far larger than any single choice would suggest. Preston, present for the argument, said almost nothing, which Judith would later come to understand was its own kind of answer. Caleb called Naomi again during this period, this time with considerably less composure than his first apology. He had begun to sense, correctly, that his wife might hold information relevant to a review that was now threatening the survival of his family's entire livelihood, and he did not know whether to be afraid of what she knew or grateful that she might help. "Naomi," he said, "if you know anything at all, that could help explain this to the bank, I need you to tell me. This is my family's whole life, Ivy's whole life too, in a way, everything we built." Naomi listened to her husband ask her, for the first time in 9 years, to actually speak up, and understood in that moment exactly what kind of help he was asking for. Not honesty, damage control. He wanted her knowledge deployed in service of protecting the same people who had put her and their daughter out in the cold 3 weeks earlier, and he wanted it without once acknowledging what those people had done to her. "If anyone asks me directly what I know," Naomi told him, "I will tell them the truth. That's the only promise I'm willing to make you." Caleb did not have a response to that. It was, in its own quiet way, the end of something between them that neither of them said out loud yet. It did not take long for Mr. Kane's investigation to lead to Naomi's name. Her signature appeared on internal reconciliation documents from the years she had managed the books during Walter's recovery, and a routine background check on anyone with historical access to the company's finances turned up her name within days. Mr. Kane requested a formal interview, and Naomi, without hesitation, agreed. She met with him at a small conference room in his office, Ruth watching Ivy for the afternoon, and answered every question he asked plainly and without embellishment. She described the vendor code discrepancy she had flagged to Denise years earlier. She described the pattern she had since identified in the older records, the inflated contract values, the equipment purchases that did not match vendor pricing. She handed over copies of the documentation she had compiled at Ruth's kitchen table in the weeks since Thanksgiving. She did not raise her voice. She did not editorialize about the family's treatment of her, though Mr. Kane, watching her closely throughout the interview, later told a colleague that he had rarely seen a witness deliver information with that particular combination of precision and restraint. Naomi was not there to punish anyone. She was there to tell the truth, finally, after 2 years of silence, to the one person who had actually asked her for it directly. What followed happened faster than anyone in the Hargrove family had prepared for. Within a week of Naomi's interview, the bank formally called in 2 of the company's largest loans, citing material misrepresentation in the original applications. A lien was placed on the company's primary equipment yard, the same yard Walter had built with his own hands 40 years earlier. A brief item ran in the local business section of the regional paper, noting that Hargrove & Sons Construction, a long-time fixture in the county's building industry, was under review for financial irregularities, a phrase that spread through the small town faster than any official announcement could have. Neighbors who had known Walter for decades began, quietly and then not so quietly, distancing themselves. 2 subcontractors who had worked with the company for years pulled their crews from active job sites, citing payment uncertainty. Judith, who had spent her entire adult life curating exactly how this family was perceived by everyone around them, watched that perception collapse in the span of roughly 10 days. By the morning after the bank's loans were formally called in, the family's attorney informed Walter that the company's insurance and bonding capacity, essential for it to legally operate on active construction sites, had been suspended pending the outcome of the review. By early afternoon, the equipment yard, the physical heart of a business Walter had built from a single used truck 4 decades earlier, was placed under a formal lien, with a notice posted at the gate that any employee arriving for a shift that day could read for themselves. By evening, word reached Judith that the house itself, the same house Naomi had been evicted from 3 weeks earlier, had been used years ago as collateral against one of the company's expanded lines of credit, a detail Walter had never fully disclosed to his wife. With the loan called in and the company unable to cover the shortfall, the bank's attorneys began the formal process of pursuing that collateral. In less than a day, the company Walter Hargrove had spent 40 years building, the house his family had lived in for 3 decades, and the reputation Judith had spent just as long protecting, were all, functionally, gone. Not stolen, not destroyed by any single villain, simply, finally, caught up with, the way debts eventually catch up with anyone who spends long enough pretending they do not exist. 24 hours after they put Naomi Hargrove out in the cold, the family that did it had lost everything they had spent a lifetime building. Judith Hargrove arrived at Ruth Delaney's front door on a grey afternoon in early December, unannounced, wearing the same composed expression she had worn her entire adult life, though Naomi could see, up close, that it was costing her considerably more effort than it used to. Ruth, who answered the door, looked ready to turn her away entirely, but Naomi, watching from the kitchen, told her it was fine. She wanted to hear whatever Judith had come to say. "I want to understand," Judith said, standing stiffly in Ruth's front hallway, "why you did this to us." Naomi considered the question for a moment before answering, because it deserved an honest answer rather than a quick one. "I didn't do anything to your family, Judith," she said. "I answered a question honestly when someone finally asked me one. That's the whole story. If you're looking for the moment your family's finances actually became a problem, it wasn't in that conference room 3 weeks ago. It happened years before I ever said a word, and I stayed quiet about it for longer than I should have because I was trying to protect people who, when it mattered most, didn't extend me the same courtesy." "You could have told us privately," Judith said. "You could have given Caleb a chance to fix it before it became public." "I did tell someone privately," Naomi said. "I told Denise, 2 years ago, about the first thing I found. She told me it was a vendor code error and changed the subject. I gave this family a chance to fix it quietly, Judith. Your daughter chose not to take it." Judith did not have an answer for that. She stood in the hallway for a long moment, and for the first time in 9 years, Naomi watched something in her mother-in-law's face that looked less like control and more like genuine, unguarded grief. Judith left without another word, and Naomi did not chase her down the driveway to soften it. She had spent 9 years softening things for this family. She was done. The fuller consequences for Denise and Preston unfolded over the following months, quieter and less dramatic than a courtroom drama, but no less real for it. The bank's civil case against the company, combined with the documented misrepresentation in the original loan applications, exposed Denise's role clearly enough that she faced significant personal liability, along with the far more painful reality of watching her own children ask her, at their own dinner table, whether their family was going to lose their house too. Preston, it turned out, had known considerably more about the inflated numbers than he had ever let on, and the strain of that secret, combined with the strain of its exposure, ended their marriage within the year. Naomi felt no satisfaction in learning this, only a kind of tired sadness for 2 more people caught in the wreckage of choices that had started small and compounded for far too long before anyone was willing to stop them. Of everyone in the family, it was Walter who came the closest to something that resembled genuine accountability. He wrote Naomi a letter in January, handwritten, which she still had folded in a drawer months later. In it, he admitted that he had known, on some level, for longer than he had ever let himself fully examine, that the numbers Denise reported to him did not entirely match what he saw with his own eyes on his own job sites. He admitted that he had let his wife and daughter run the day-to-day of a business he had built, because confronting them would have meant admitting that the family he had spent his whole life protecting was not quite the family he had always told himself it was. "I should have looked closer, years ago," he wrote. "And I should have said something to you, that night at Thanksgiving, when my wife told you that you weren't welcome in a house you'd spent 9 years making a home. I am sorry for my silence twice over, once for the numbers, and once for you." Naomi did not respond to the letter. She did not need to. She kept it, though, because it was the one piece of honesty this family had ever offered her, without her having to extract it first. Caleb came to Ruth's house once more, in late January, after the worst of the immediate collapse had settled into a long, grinding process of legal and financial cleanup that would occupy his family for years to come. He looked, for the first time since Naomi had known him, genuinely uncertain of himself, stripped of the easy confidence that had drawn her to him at a wedding a decade earlier. "I don't know how to fix this," he said. "Any of it. Us, my family, any of it." Naomi looked at him for a long moment and felt, to her own surprise, less anger than a kind of settled clarity. "I'm not sure there's an us to fix, Caleb," she said. "Not because of what happened with your family's business. Because of what happened before that. For 9 years, every time I needed you to stand up for me, and you looked at your mother instead. I don't think that's something either of us can go back and undo." They did not divorce dramatically. There was no final screaming match, no courtroom scene worthy of the rest of this story. There was, instead, a quiet, honest conversation about custody and finances, conducted with more mutual respect than either of them had managed to offer each other during much of the marriage itself, and an agreement, unspoken but understood by both of them, that whatever they had built together had already ended, quietly, on a cold porch on Thanksgiving night, long before either of them said the word divorce out loud. Through all of it, Ivy remained, as she always had been, the clearest and steadiest thing in Naomi's life. She adjusted to the new school faster than Naomi expected, made a best friend within the first month, and began, slowly, to ask fewer questions about Grandma's house and more questions about ordinary 8-year-old things, upcoming school plays, and a birthday party she wanted to have in the spring. One evening, months after Thanksgiving, Naomi found the old coloring book drawing again while unpacking boxes at Ruth's house, the one with every stick figure drawn the same size, Naomi in the middle, holding it all together. She showed it to Ivy, who looked at it with the mild, distracted curiosity of a child looking at something she made a long time ago and had mostly forgotten. "That's still true, you know," Ivy said, matter of fact, already reaching for a different toy. "You still hold it together." Naomi did not say anything back. She did not trust her voice to hold, and some things, she had learned, did not need an answer out loud. By the following spring, Naomi had opened a small forensic accounting practice out of a modest office above a bakery in the same town where she had once worked at the firm she left behind nearly a decade earlier. Word traveled quickly in a small community, and the story of the woman who had quietly uncovered what a bank's own review had taken weeks to fully untangle did not stay private for long. Her first clients came from referrals, cautious business owners who wanted a second set of eyes on their books, the exact kind of work Naomi had once given up without ever quite deciding to. Ruth helped her with the paperwork of starting a business, insisting on it the way she insisted on most things, with quiet, immovable certainty. Naomi hired an assistant within the first year. She kept the office small, and she kept it entirely her own, her name on the door for the first time in her adult life. No family business, no husband's last name doing the work of explaining who she was to people who had not yet met her. By early summer, Naomi and Ivy had moved into a small house of their own, modest by the Hargrove family's standards, warm by every standard that actually mattered. It had a kitchen half the size of Judith's, with a window over the sink that caught the morning light in a way Naomi found she looked forward to every single day. Ivy's drawings went up on the refrigerator without anyone suggesting they be moved somewhere less visible for guests. There was no chandelier in this house, no dining room built to seat 14 people for a holiday where Naomi would end up at the far end of the table. There was, instead, a small kitchen table where the two of them ate dinner most nights, just the two of them, and where Naomi found, to her quiet surprise, that she did not miss the larger table at all. Judith and Walter sold what remained of their assets over the following year to settle the worst of the company's debts, and moved into a much smaller condominium on the other side of town, a version of downsizing Judith had never once imagined for herself. Walter, in his 70s, took a part-time consulting role with a competitor's construction firm, work he described to Naomi, in a brief and unexpected phone call the following autumn, as humbling, in a way I probably needed a long time ago. Denise, after her divorce from Preston finalized, moved out of state to live near her adult children. and Naomi heard, second-hand, that she had taken a bookkeeping job considerably smaller and considerably more closely supervised than the position she once held at her father's company. Caleb remained in the area, maintained a steady if quieter relationship with Ivy, and, as far as Naomi could tell, had not yet found the particular kind of courage that had been missing from him for most of the years she had known him. She hoped, without any real bitterness left in her by that point, that he eventually would. There is a version of this story where Naomi Hargrove gets even, where she waits for her moment and takes it and burns down the family that wronged her out of something closer to satisfaction than necessity. That is not what happened, and it is worth saying plainly, because it is the truest part of the whole story. Naomi did not destroy her husband's family. She simply stopped protecting people who had never once protected her. For 9 years, she absorbed small humiliations she told herself did not matter, stayed quiet about a problem she noticed because speaking up felt more dangerous than staying silent, and made herself smaller, meal after meal, holiday after holiday, so that a family that was never going to make room for her would have one less reason to push her out entirely. They pushed her out anyway, and the only thing that changed after that, the only thing, was that she finally stopped covering for them. Everything that followed, the audit, the collapse, the loss of a house and a business, and 40 years of careful reputation, was not something Naomi did to the Hargrove family. It was something they had already done to themselves, slowly, over years, long before Naomi ever said a word. She simply stopped being the reason it stayed hidden. If you have ever spent years making yourself smaller for people who were never going to make room for you, I hope Naomi's story reminds you of something worth remembering. You are not obligated to keep protecting people who would not do the same for you. Telling the truth, plainly and without cruelty, when someone finally asks you for it, is not revenge. It is simply the end of a silence you never should have had to carry alone in the first place. If this story moved you, I would love to hear about it in the comments below. And if you know someone who has ever been made to feel small by the people who were supposed to protect them, share this with them. They might need to hear it today. Thank you for spending this time with us. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We would love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos.